Or
Yes.
do you need
No, I can auto start, if
Yes.
that's all right.
Yes.
Okay. Did everyone have a good lunch? Number one.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So my name is Saskya Vandoorne. I am the CNN Paris Bureau Chief. I'm so thrilled to be back at Sciences Po, because I was at Sciences Po. I was doing a kind of part-time journalism program for international. I think, Sciences Po to thank for where I am today, because there was a teacher at the time called Laurence Bagot. She was the one who encouraged me to apply for this Associated Press internship. And because I did the internship, I then met people at CNN. I was put in contact with a lot of people at CNN kind of across the world. And that was clearly my career trajectory. I've now been at CNN for 15 years. So I was working in the New York bureau, and now I am back in Paris, and I'm heading the bureau here. So it's not just my career that I have Sciences Po to thank, because I will forever be indebted to them. Funny story, I hosted a New Year's Eve party, and I invited a graduate journalism school who was a friend of mine. He asked me if he could bring a friend, also a graduate of the journalism school. I said, of course, and that friend is now my husband. So we have 3 kids together. He's also a journalist. He has a job that is far cooler than mine. He covers cinema for AFP. So he just watches movies all day. So anyway, about me today, we are here to talk about ethics. Important topic. But I wanted to start off by sharing an anecdote with you. And I wanted you guys to try and kind of think about this anecdote throughout the presentation, and then we can come back to it at the end. My colleague Melissa Ball, she's the correspondent in Paris. In 2022, we went to Ukraine. We were there in May, so it was about 2 months after Bucha was liberated. And when we got there, it was going to be the first war crimes trial. So we were in a courthouse in Kyiv. I remember it was incredibly packed. The kind of world's media was there, as were Ukrainian journalists. And the Russian soldier who was on trial was called Vadim Shishimarin. He was 21 years old, and he was accused of having shot an unarmed civilian. And really well, he came into the courtroom. He had a very baby face. He looked actually younger than 21. And when he took the stand, he said, he pled guilty, and he said that the reason he had shot this unarmed civilian was because he was ordered to. That he had tried multiple times to refuse the order, to say no, but in the end, he felt pressured to do it, and he shot him. And there was this interpreter inside the court room. She was interpreting from Russian to Ukrainian. And at one point, she got very emotional and she broke down into tears, and she started mumbling something into the microphone. So I turned to my local producer, Ukrainian local producer, and I asked her, what is she saying? And she said, of course, yeah, no problem. This happens a lot. And she said, the interpreter just said, the tears of Russian mothers are salty too. And I remember thinking, wow, that's a pretty powerful comment, pretty powerful statement to make. And I said, that quote in your report, and we can come back to it at the end of the presentation. But it's just something to think about. So ethics in journalism. Without ethics, there's no journalism. It would be fiction. So I hope you get the idea from this quote that ethics and journalism go hand in hand. They are not separable. But if the reasons we started out as a journalist are ethical, that does not mean that we can be sure that our work continues to be ethical on a daily basis. So of course ethics can be taught, but there is something to be said about doing the right thing in the right moment. And I'm going to play a clip for you right now. It is a clip of Clarissa Ward, our chief international correspondent, who I believe has given actually a masterclass in the past. And here she is reporting live. This is a live report in Ukraine. I'm just going to fast forward to the moment.
We're here on the...
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the moment that I think is pertinent to our discussion today.
People are so exhausted, they can barely walk. They're having to climb this sort of twisted metal. Many of them, as you can see, are elderly. They're visibly distressed. It's just an awful, awful scene. And these people are the lucky ones. Можно вам помочь? Можно вам помочь? Мне очень жарко. Это плохая. Можно вам помочь? Давайте мне вот это. Давайте мне. I'm just gonna help her carry this bag a second. Excuse me, John. While we try to... Ну вот, ничего страшного, ничего страшного. Как вас зовут? So people are obviously incredibly affected by this situation.
So I just want to open this up to the room now. Do you think Clarissa should have got involved? Should she have helped that woman during her live shot? Okay, I see someone nodding. Can you tell me why you think that was okay?
I don't know, but I think that even if she's a journalist, and that, like, we often say that we really have to separate our roles, like, and do not get involved, because then we will not be in our role of journalist. But I think in such situation, which is conflict zone, I think you cannot separate the two. And I mean, you have to help someone if you are able to do so. So I think the fact that she did this, it doesn't make her less of a journalist, but more of a human. And I think that you have to show to people that conflict zones are also zones where humanity is really important. And I think she just does she does this very well in all her reports also. So no, I think that's normal.
I completely agree with you. I don't think it undermines her credibility. If anything, I think it just shows that she is human. She cares about human dignity. She saw someone who needed help during that live shot, and she helped this elderly woman. It shows what Clarissa, the kind of values Clarissa has. So I'm in complete agreement with you. So we go into journalism with ethical intentions, which is why personal morality comes into play continually when we do our work. But in order for journalists, news organizations, and journalism as an institution to function, it needs to be trusted. If we lose trust, then we are no longer functioning as journalists. If we're not ethical, we're essentially out of business. And beyond that, journalism has a public service role, which means that our work goes beyond private matters and affects wider society. Citizens look to the news to inform them about the political, societal, and economic reality in which they live. If we want functioning democracies, then we need ethical journalism so that citizens can make informed choices. I really like this quote from Tim Langmaid, former vice president and senior editorial director at CNNI. He says, "You may have to set some of your own values aside in order to do your job. Your ethical compass as a journalist sometimes supersedes your moral compass as a person." So what did Tim mean by that? I think he meant that while your personal compass may have got you into journalism, personal morality is not sufficient to guide your actions as an ethical journalist. Ethics will sometimes require that you act in a way that might be against your personal morals. So for example, you might be working in a country where there are certain laws or practices that you consider to be morally wrong. It would be unethical to let your morals color your reporting on that country. An example would be Afghanistan. You might be reporting on a group of people who hold beliefs and values that are against your personal morality. Again, it would be unethical to let your morals colour your reporting on that group. We've got a correspondent, Donnie O'Sullivan. He does a lot of work covering QAnon. And so when Donnie is meeting with this group, he needs to put his personal beliefs aside to be able to speak to them. They may believe in conspiracy theories, but Donnie has to put that aside to be able to tell their story. And then finally, you might receive information about the wrongdoing of a powerful individual who you believe to be abusing their power, but you lack confirmation. Again, your ethics as a journalist prevents you from publishing that information. So we're just going to watch a report clip from Nick Payton Walsh, who this report is about a Russian prison, and of course it's during the war. Take a look. Oh, no.
The camera is in the unsteady hands of a prisoner, but the apparent scene is still startling. Convicts in a southern Russia penitentiary being recruited to fight the Kremlin's war in Ukraine, according to a witness. It's an offer being made in cramped prisons across Russia. One prisoner, like many in this murky underworld it's rare to glimpse inside, wanted his identity hidden as he explained the deal.
Rapists, pedophiles, extremists, terrorists are not taken. Murderers are accepted.
На каких условиях contract? What are the terms of the contract?
Amnesty in 6 months.
Что по деньгам обещают? What kind of money are they promising?
Somebody talks about 100,000 rubles, somebody about 200,000.
Russia's small victories in this war have come with huge losses, and after about 6 months, regular soldiers have been hit hard, with up to 60,000 Russian dead or wounded troops, say Western officials. So now Russia is making ugly choices in its ugly war, sending convicts to fight.
So I think you get the picture here that the subject of this story is Russian convicts, people who had committed crimes, including murder, and now they're being sent to war to kill again. So these are unsympathetic subjects. Morally, we would have a problem with, the crimes they've committed. But again, in order to file this report, Nick had to set aside his personal feelings about what these people were guilty of in order to tell their story. So that story is not about whether, as a journalist or member of the audience, we sympathize with those Russian convicts or not. The issues go beyond our personal morality. And I've got an example, which was during the Dominic Pellico trial, which I'm sure many of you followed here. I know Juliette Campion came and gave a masterclass. We were putting together a report on Dominic Pellico and how he had recruited the men at the time. And in the report, we had the opportunity to use an interview of a defendant, so a man who had been accused of raping Giselle Pellico. And we had a lot of discussions about whether we should use a soundbite from this interview, because we would be giving him a platform of sorts. And did we want to, give him room to try and legitimize what he had done? But what we were trying to do was to show how the website Coco, which Dominic Pellico used to recruit a lot of the men, how it was used. And the defendant in the interview spoke at length about this website. And he said that if it hadn't been for the website, he would never have been put in touch with Dominic Pellico. It was the ease with which he was able to go on the website, find Dominic Pellico, that meant he then ended up committing this atrocious act. And so after many discussions, we decided to just use that soundbite so that we could demonstrate the role that Coco had played in this crime, how it had been, in some way, the weapon of the crime. So we decided, sometimes it's just as important what you leave out as what you put in to the piece. So the other perspective from which to view journalist ethics is from an individual level. And I think this is super important, because what principles do we as individual journalists need to bring to bear on a day-to-day basis? The first principle I want to talk about is minimizing harm. So I really like this quote from Rafael Romo. He said, "I work very hard to make sure the rights of victims are always protected. And when I work on a sensitive story, I treat it as a doctor would treat a patient. In other words, do no harm." Sadly, most of the work that we do as journalists is at some level about human suffering. We have a duty to the public whose lives have often been affected by forces more powerful than them, whether it's a weather event, an invading army, or indeed their own government. But of course, when we are broadcasting the pain of others, we have a duty not to add to their pain. We have a duty of care. And this reminds me of another time when Melissa, Bell and I, again, we were sent to Greece. We were sent to a little town called Mati, where there had been devastating wildfires. Many lives had been lost, houses, homes reduced to rubble. And when we arrived, we got there just as the fire had kind of been put out. So we didn't even know sometimes that we were on people's properties because all we could see were kind of rocks, rubble, and at one point we were next to what was once a home, and we were filming, and then we heard a woman arrive and she was hysterical. And as we turned around, we very quickly realized that this was the owner of the house, and she was coming back, having escaped, she was coming back, and this is what she was finding of the home she had left behind. She had lived here for decades. And not only was she obviously coming back to discover what was left of her home, but we then found out later on that she had also lost her neighbors. And as soon as we saw her and we saw her distress, we realized that we shouldn't be there. We didn't need to discuss, we didn't need to speak to each other. We knew that we shouldn't be there. So we began to leave. But to our great surprise, she ran after us and she said, please don't go, I need to tell you about my neighbors. I want you to hear about who they were. I want everybody to know their story. And so we needed to make a decision in that moment. Were we going to add to her pain by asking her questions, by putting a camera in front of her face? Or did we feel that it was okay and that she was indeed ready and in an emotional state where she could actually speak with us? And so again, these decisions, sometimes you can go in with the best will in the world, but you're having to make the decisions on the ground, sometimes under pressure. And it's always a good idea to speak to colleagues, speak to other people, if you are worried that you might be doing something wrong. I always say that you can be guided by your gut as well. Sometimes we get that feeling when we shouldn't be somewhere, or we're putting a camera in someone's face and we feel a little bit icky. Listen to that, because that's usually your kind of inner moral compass telling you whether or not something is right. And another thing to think about when we're talking about trying to minimize harm is intrusiveness. So we need to balance the public need for information against invasions of privacy and personal life of individuals. Do any of you here remember the MH17 crash? Yeah? So it was a flight that was leaving from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, and it was shot down by the Russians over Ukraine. So again, it was one of those scenes where journalists got there very quickly. There was no cordon that had been set up. And when journalists arrived, there were literally bodies were still there. There were suitcases open. There were objects, clothes, just strewn all over the floor. And there was a British broadcaster, not CNN, but there was a British anchor who was there at the time. He has since apologized for what happened in this moment. But he was live, and as I was telling you earlier, under a great deal of pressure. When you are live, you're wanting to show the scene, you're wanting to share what you are there, what you're witnessing. But he started getting down on the ground and he started picking through the objects, the clothing that was in the suitcase. And you could see that something suddenly, as we say in French, quelque chose a tilté, when he saw a teddy bear, and it was obviously a kid's toy. And he realized in that moment, I shouldn't be doing this. And he apologized and he moved away. But of course, the reason that he had that feeling inside that told him to stop was because not all the families might have been told about the crash. They might be discovering in real time by seeing, the teddy. It could be a grandparent, it could be a sister. They could be seeing this teddy and realizing that teddy belonged to, their niece, nephew, son, whatever. So again, it's in those moments that you have to always think, do I feel like what I'm doing is right? And don't just, we're lucky at CNN in that we always travel with a team. There's a producer, there's a correspondent, there's a cameraman. There are usually 3 of us to kind of have discussions. Is this the right thing to do? But beyond that, you have a news desk usually. Sometimes you have a control room. There have been instances where we have teams that are about to go live and someone in the control room says, hang on, are you sure you should be doing a live shot from this location? Or what are you planning on doing? So that again, you have that conversation and you are not adding to more anguish, more grief. You want to minimize the harm as much as possible. So now I wanted to talk about staying independent, which is also very, very important when talking about ethics. So the following are the forces that have been identified as sources of editorial bias. As we go through them, I want you to think of the ways in which they might compromise a journalist's independence. Private media are ultimately responsible to their owners, shareholders, individuals, or corporations who have a financial stake in the company. Their interests are profit and competitiveness, not necessarily in the public interest. So think about when big businesses and government have close ties, what then? Most private media is supported to some extent by advertising, big companies paying for visibility of their brands on air or in print. And finally, as journalists, we are always working with sources, but not all sources are equal. Some sources may be more powerful than others. And think about the importance of access. If a journalist wants to continue to receive stories from a source, might they be forced to take the interests of that source into consideration when reporting on those stories? And I have an example there. A few months ago, an intelligence source called me up on a Saturday, a very trusted intelligence source. And he said to me, I have got a piece of exclusive information that I want to share with you and that I think, CNN will be very interested in. I said, I'm all ears. And then he continued and he said, but you need to publish this in the next 24 to 48 hours. I said, I'm going to have to stop you there because you do not dictate when we publish a story. Only we can decide when it's right to publish a story. And you are one source bringing me this piece of information. I'm going to need to corroborate it with a second source, maybe a third. And he said, well, that's fine, but I'm afraid I'm then going to take this information to someone else. So I knew we were going to lose out on an exclusive, but it was the right thing to do because journalistic integrity, you need to be able to stick to your guns sometimes and not give in to the pressure, even if that means passing up an exclusive. Never feel like you have to, forego your journalistic ethics or integrity just to get something out there, because that is when you will get burned.
Yeah. Do you know what the information was at the end?
I do, yes, yeah. I could tell you about it now, but I don't also want to talk. But you'll be able to find it, but I don't want to talk about I don't particularly want to name the media company that did go with it in the end, because they did follow the rules of the 24 hours. But maybe they were able to corroborate it just faster than we were. But yes, it was a good piece of intel. So being transparent, this is also super important. There are different aspects of our work that can be opened up to extra transparency for audiences. It's sometimes appropriate to explain to audiences the decision to cover certain stories. Why are you covering a story? Why are you giving this prominence? Sometimes it helps audiences to understand why you've put so many resources into a story. When it comes to how you are covering individual stories, there can be transparency of source material, for example. More and more when we, let's use the Louvre heist, for example, we will, whilst telling the story, actually reveal how we came to maybe a certain conclusion. And it will be, showing our OSINT techniques, open source intelligence, It'll be showing our fact-finding mission. And sometimes we find that showing the audience how the sausage is made can help them, again, trust us and understand how we cover the story. And then finally, in other areas, it might be a good idea for your audience to know about how your news organization is funded, because non-profit foundations are funding journalism more and more these days. And in many countries, it's these organizations that audiences worry have an undue influence over media narratives. So now we're going to talk about the ethics of online journalism and social media. So David Culver, one of our correspondents, and he said, social media in many ways brought us back to the traditional roots of journalism. It's conversation, it's dialogue, it's back and forth. So questions about the journalism ethics in the online era definitely have not been resolved, and there are so many alternative viewpoints for us to unpack that I don't think we'd have enough time today to go through all of them. But what I want to emphasize and open up a discussion about is summed up by what David says here. He's saying it's impossible for journalists these days to be detached from the audience because we all live, in a sense, on the same social media. So it's a good thing, according to David, to be closer to our audiences through social media. On the other hand, a couple of years ago, the BBC told all of its journalists that they should not use social media to express personal opinions on matters of public policy, politics, or controversial subjects. Basically, any issue that they may report on in their professional work. So there appears to be kind of two schools of thought here which actually reflect the ambiguous position that journalists are in on social media. On the one hand, like the BBC, you want professionals to follow ethical guidelines and to follow a code of conduct. But on the other, we are, as we saw in the beginning with Clarissa Ward, we are all human beings and we do all have opinions. So I'd like to open it up to the room now and just ask you a question. Do you think journalists should share their personal opinions on social media? Yes? Right here. No.
Well, I think it depends on I think it's very subjective because opinions do differ on different things and what you define as an opinion. I generally base my own posting on social media after the other journalists that I follow and respect, like Caitlin Collins. And so I'm aware that they post things that maybe their opinions about sports teams, and I think that's ethical because they don't cover that. Mm-hmm. But when it is something you cover, I think it is something you should avoid, because then you're showing cards that you maybe shouldn't show, and then at the same time you're supposed to remove those already, and so showing that you have really strong opinions one way or another kind of removes your impartiality as a journalist. I don't know.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that legacy media has definitely tended to obviously say that we should not be sharing, our personal opinions. However, I think in today's, day and age, more and more viewers, audiences are being drawn towards people where they do know their personal opinions and they feel safer in trusting them because they feel that they're aware of their personal bias from the get-go. So I think it's an interesting question to look into, and one that has obviously no kind of right or wrong answer. And then finally, I wanted to play this video. This is Matthew Chance in Moscow, and this is during the COVID pandemic.
This is the pandemic response of a vast state-of-the-art field hospital set up to manage the coronavirus. And we're just about to head into the red zone. It was a World Championship ice skating stadium called the Ice Palace. Now the view from the stands is 1,300 beds. The staff of highly protected medics, apparently in control of this COVID-19 crisis. We have all the necessary diagnostic equipment, including ultrasound and ventilators. The chief doctor on the left tells me. The Russian government is taking serious anti-coronavirus measures, he insists, not just here in Moscow, but far beyond. But there's another side of Russia's raging pandemic.
So as you can tell, we blurred some of the patients' faces and some other patients we didn't. And that was because some of the patients gave us their authorizations and others weren't able to. So this again goes to show like the great pains that we go to try and mask people's identities when they haven't given us the authorization to show it. And sometimes this goes back to the kind of duty of care that we have to the people we interview. You may come across a situation where the interviewee tells you, yes, I'm happy to share my name and I'm happy to share my identity, to have my face be on camera. But you as a journalist may feel that they haven't quite understood the ramifications of this. And you might then say, well, it may be fine that you are okay with divulging all this information, but for me, I would feel better if I didn't divulge this. So I'm actually going to go ahead and blur your face and not give out your real name. And I mean, that was something that happened when Clarissa was in Syria and she was interviewing some people who were against the regime, and she just felt that it was too dangerous to put any kind of names out there. And we had a similar situation. It was when we were in Brussels, and we had managed to find these two teenagers who were friends with the Abdeslam brothers. And it was amazing because they shared this video of us, of Salah Abdeslam and his brother, partying a few months before the Paris attacks. And it was video that had never been seen before. And to just be able to speak to these guys who had known them was pretty extraordinary. And I remember they showed us, we made sure that we blurred their faces. In fact, we made sure that they didn't have anything that would identify them in terms of even their clothes. They'd taken different clothes for the interview, ones that they'd never worn before. And then when we were in post-production, the phone that they were showing us the video on, we didn't think that there was anything distinguishable about the phone. And yet it was the editor who later on said, well, hang on, there are a few cracks that you can see on the side of this phone. And so it would be better to blur the whole phone because their friends didn't even know they were giving us this interview. And so again, it shows you just the level of detail sometimes that you have to go to, that you have to look at to try and protect the people that you are interviewing. Because once again, you do have a duty of care. You are in a position of power. You are the ones who are interviewing them and who are then going to be broadcasting that to the entire world. So that is the end of the presentation, and I just wanted to kind of go back to that initial anecdote that I shared with you about that Russian soldier, Vadim Shishamarin, and the interpreter saying, the tears of Russian mothers are salty too. I would just love to know, would anybody here have not included that quote in their piece? Okay, so who would have included it? Okay, can you tell me why?
Well, I think it humanizes the entire story. If we only look at it from one perspective, we immediately lose the other side. So I feel like in not including it would be a disgrace to the end of the story, because that is what happened, essentially. This is what you saw, and including it gives an emotional depth to the story that it wouldn't be as poignant otherwise, I think.
I agree, and that is why in the end we did end up including it. We felt that it spoke to the senselessness of war. And sometimes it's not about taking sides, it's just about, putting the truth out there, even if it feels uncomfortable. So I now wanted to just open it up to find out if you guys have got any questions. Yes, I'm all ears.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So recently we heard a lot about the negotiation between CNN and Paramount. So did you ask yourself the question of what would you do if the CNN was sold to Paramount, and would you consider quitting, or maybe I want to know?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, regardless of whoever eventually owns CNN, because even if it's Netflix, which isn't completely done yet, obviously still has to go through the courts. I believe in CNN as a machine. I think some of the colleagues that I work with are the most incredible journalists in the world, frankly. You know, you mentioned Caitlin Collins earlier. She's absolutely extraordinary. And that's not going to go away with whoever ends up owning us. We have, in fact, I'd love to speak to you guys about Triad, which is something that is very specific to CNN and which I think is what sometimes sets CNN apart from some of the other media companies. Triad is made out of 3 pillars. One of them is called fact check. So that is fact check. That is what all the scripts, all of our articles go through. It does what it says on the tin. It fact checks your copy. Then the next stage is standards and practices. So that's going to tell you, for example, standards and practices might be the person who will tell you, so you've decided not to blur these patients' faces. Why? Or you haven't blurred them, you need to, okay? And then we have legal, and they're going to be the ones who are going to say, okay, well, have you managed to get every side of the story? You know, we need to make sure that we have all of our T's crossed, our I's dotted to make sure that we are legally sound here. Every single script, every single article goes through those layers. And it can be painstakingly long. Sometimes, you know, you're there, you want to push it out, you want to get it out as quickly as possible, but that is why they are here. They're here so that we don't make mistakes, so that we are solid, and so that what we end up putting out there is not only legally sound, but has been fact-checked, and, you know, we're making the right decisions. So whoever ends up owning CNN, I'm confident that that structure will always be there, and that, you know, CNN will remain the way that it is.
And you don't think that if it was sold to Paramount, like the idea would not be more conservative, for example?
I think, again, regardless of who were to, you know, whoever ends up owning us, those things will not go away. And I'm confident in the integrity of the journalists with whom I work, that they would continue to uphold that integrity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned Clarissa Ward, and when I was at L'Express, we made a video about the whole debacle in Syria, where she filmed a supposed Syrian prisoner who ended up being a war criminal, basically. How do you analyze that from the inside? What happened? Why was that video published without checking who the guy actually was, even though they managed to see pretty quickly that he wasn't who he was saying he was?
Yeah. I think, you know, and we've obviously communicated on this at great length, but we were reporting what he told us, right? So it ended up being that he wasn't who he said he was. And there were checks that were made. There were initial checks that were made. And it was only, you know, after, when the story had kind of got out there, that we got all of that additional information. But it was done in good faith. You know, I saw so many reports saying that the whole thing had been staged, that, you know, this guy was an actor. And of course, all of that is false. And it goes back to what I was telling you before. You know, there are lots of checks that these scripts and articles go through. And unfortunately, sometimes you are misled by the people you are interviewing. So, you know, since then, we obviously corrected the story and, in fact, did a whole piece on who this man really was.
Hello, I have a question concerning the video you just showed
Yes.
us. How long does it take normally to get the authorization to film, like in those buildings or in those occasions?
Sorry, you're talking about Russia specifically, or are you talking
no, like in any occasion, like if you have to film someone who is like in a difficult situation. I mean, in that case, isn't it easier to blur everyone's face? And I mean, if you have like pressure and you have to go live, isn't it just easier to just...
It could be easier, but I almost feel that, and I didn't show you the whole piece, but it's sometimes, if you have a patient who's in there who is, you know, in pain, in agony, and has been sitting on a brancard for like 3 days, then, you know, to show that agony is actually going to speak to the audience a little bit more. So I think that it always depends on what you're trying to get across with your story. And then in terms of access, you know, I mean, that was very difficult access. Hospitals, you know, have, you know, different kind of rules and regulations when it comes to filming inside them. In France, I remember after the Nice attack, we were in hospitals a lot, and they were actually fairly quick at giving us authorizations and approvals. But sometimes and as I said, every hospital has different rules. There are some hospitals who will say you have to go up to each and every patient and ask them. So yeah, it can be easier sometimes just to put a blur on all of them. But if you're trying to show that this is like a dire situation, then exactly that they're in great distress, then it helps if you can show their faces so that you actually see, a human in the piece.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you tell us, please, your own personal limits on what you can post or can't post on social media?
That's a great question. We do have a very strict, guidelines when it comes to what we're posting on social media, and that's why I actually have a personal account and I have a professional account. I'm not even on my personal one. I mean, I'm not silly enough to think that someone might not screen grab something that I posted and broadcast it. So usually I will never share a personal opinion, especially if it's on, maybe Donald Trump or Emmanuel Macron or, Marine Le Pen, whoever. But because that's what, CNN is constantly trying to drive forward, it is that we should be covering the news in the most objective, way possible, and that if you start sharing your personal opinions, then that is not only going to color your reporting, but it is going to color the way that, the audience looks at your reports. And I've seen far too many journalists in my career, illustrious journalists, lose their jobs because of a tweet, because of an Instagram post, because of something they've put on Facebook. So I always say, save it for the pub. Save it for, the bar. If you want to talk about, your personal opinions, I just don't see the value in sharing them out there.
It's more like a personal question, so if you don't want to answer, it's okay. But actually, it's two questions. But first, like how you started and then became a journalist, or your own personal path, and then what's it like to have a family, and you and your partner, you're both journalists, and you have 3 children. So how do you organize your everyday life and yeah?
Gosh, wow, that's a lot to get into. No. So how did I start? Well, so I had that internship at Associated Press. I really mean it. I wasn't even going to go, I think, for this internship at first, but Laurence Bergaud, the teacher at the time, said, I really think you'll like it. And it wasn't just AP text, it was AP video. So Jeff Schaefer, I don't know if any of you guys have come across him, but he was my great mentor, still is to this day. And I remember when I was one of those journalists, those baby journalists, who just knew from the beginning that I wanted to work at CNN, and I wanted to work at CNN International. I'm half French, half English. I was born in the States. So I wanted to be able to kind of travel around. I wanted to be able to have the freedom to work in different countries. And so I was just, always had CNN in my sights. So I remember when I first started at AP, I went to Jeff and I said, I can't wait to start this internship. How do I get into CNN? And Jeff, well, it just so happens that, he was very good friends with Jim Bitterman, the bureau chief at the time and the correspondent. And it was really, as I'm sure Marie teaches you here on a day-to-day basis, daily basis, it is sometimes just getting your foot in the door and then, being able to show that you are a competent journalist, that then it'll be word of mouth. Someone will then recommend you to someone else. And that's what happened with me. Jeff went to Jim and said, I've got this intern who didn't completely, drop the ball. And you may want to think about, trying her out as an intern. And then from that, from the intern, I then became a full-time employee, and then went to London, New York, and then back to Paris. So that's how I kind of got into CNN and my path. And then when it comes to balancing family life and my job, it has not been the smoothest of paths. It's not been the smoothest of, I think it's one of those like trial and errors. I remember when I'd given birth to my second son and he was 5.5 months, and then Ukraine happened. And I remember turning to my husband and saying, I think I'm going to cut my maternity leave short, which I'm sure, you know, many people in here probably judge, I don't know. But my husband, because he's a journalist, said, I completely understand and you should go. And so I left, and I remember one of the questions I got when I arrived there was, but who's with the children? And it's still a question that I find so difficult, because it's, you know, obviously you get the guilt, and then you kind of think, what, my husband can't look after, you know, the children? I mean, I think he's fully capable. And so, yeah, there was, you know, I went to Ukraine 3 times in that first year that my son was born, and it was tricky, it was difficult, you know, their parents, my husband's parents, my parents, nannies. And then I would be lying if I didn't tell you that the answer by the time I had my 3rd child was a live-in au pair. That was the only way that I was going to be able to actually make anything function and keep my marriage alive, was by having an extra pair of hands. So I realized the privilege, and I realized how fortunate I am to be able to live in a place where we can have a live-in au pair. And I'm sure that wouldn't help, you know, any kind of mothers out there who are watching and are wondering how they can do it if they can't have, you know, a live-in au pair. But I would always say, just, you know, outsourcing the help, getting into, it's almost like producing, you know. I mean, I felt like my skills as a producer really came in handy when I was a mother, because when I became a mother, because that's what it was all about. It was just trying to kind of pick resources from here, from there, to be able to make the family function. So there we go, that was a very honest answer.
I had a question more about your day-to-day job. Since you're working for CNN, I was wondering what type of subjects interest CNN? Like, for instance, like, did you focus on the budget or anything?
Yeah, great question. We were so focused on the budget. I mean, we were focused because, and we found this with our audience. Our audience is very interested in France, as in with Le Cornu and the government and les dissolutions, when things go wrong. They're not interested quand ils esquivent la catastrophe, but they are very interested when it feels like we're on a precipice. So with Le Cornu, and obviously the kind of revolving door of prime ministers, I think that was a time when there was a lot of interest in what was going on politically. And of course, this all plays into Macron's role on the international stage. If Macron is there trying to, you know, show that he's the strong man of Europe, and then at home his house is in disarray, that's not really going to help him. And that is, once again, why we would be covering that kind of story, would be to not just talk about the domestic you know, turmoil, but to show how this might have an impact on the international stage. So, you know, I think the budget is something we were interested in because of, you know, Macron's role in that as well, and what it meant for France. But then other stories like the Louvre, we dined out on that for days. You know, there was a huge interest in the Louvre, and that's because it's seen as a crown jewel of not just France, but really the world. And so it you know, there's obviously politics, there's culture, there's so much to cover here in France. You know, I always tell young, bright students when I meet them, like you, who might want to one day kind of intern at CNN, I always say the stories I'm looking for are the ones that are distinctive, that you might have access to that no one else has, you know, access to, or something that is just completely off the beaten track. I mean, I did a story recently on le système viager en France, which is, you know, like people, it blew like some of the people in America's, like their minds. They just couldn't believe that this was a system that we had here. But of course, when you look into the system, it makes total sense. And it's not as morbid as people think it is. But that did so well online, on social media, and on our shows. And that was because it was something that was intrinsically French, that all of you guys have known probably, you know, growing up. But that's the thing, you need to sometimes think about, okay, if I'm coming here as, you know, an American from Oklahoma. Like, what am I going to find that is different, that is curious, that is la petite pépite, you know, something different. So I think that's one of my suggestions for when you're maybe pitching stories, when you're thinking about an international news organization, is how is it distinctive and what access do you have and how is it different from everything else that might be out there?
One last question.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I had a question about the elections coming up in France, both in like city elections and the presidential one, and how you will treat it and cover it for Americans, and what are their interests in it?
That's a good question. I think we're more focused, just because of everything that's going on in the world right now, especially with what's going on in the US, I think there is slightly more there's going to be more of a focus on the presidential election, and we're even going to kind of start talking about it when we hit the year mark in terms of, you know, a year from now there'll be the presidential election. And the way, again, that CNN tends to work is we like to see it through maybe kind of an American prism. So the far right, which of course is incredibly, interesting to Americans. So what are the, how are they distancing themselves maybe from Trump, or what are the things that they would like to bring over and emulate? Like, I was recently at this far right kind of finishing school, and when I was there at l'IFP, and when I was there, they told me that they loved the idea of Doge, that Doge was something that they would like to bring here to France. So that's the kind of story that we would do. We would kind of talk about, okay, a year from now, the favorites are the RN. How are they similar? Like, what are their links to people like Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump, et cetera, CPAC, right? Try and find some of the things that they're trying to emulate and bring over here, but also what makes them different, how are they distancing themselves from it. So again, it's always trying to think about how would this interest. It is CNN International, it's not American audience, but it does help if a piece can not only live on CNN International, but can also live on CNN domestic.
I was wondering how CNN is working in the foreign countries. Like here in France, how many are you? Are you working only with your journalists, or also working with independent French journalists? And like, could we work for a media like you about our country or in foreign country? How?
So we're quite a small team here. There are 2 producers, a correspondent, a shooter, and then we have a kind of person who looks after the planning. In fact, some of you might have him as a teacher, Chris Liakos. He decides who kind of gets sent. Yeah, we love Chris. Yeah, so he's awesome. So he's going to decide kind of sometimes who's deployed where, what stories we cover. He's fantastic. But it is quite a small team. We do work with freelancers. We work with freelancers in other countries, absolutely. We'll have freelancers in Venezuela, we'll have freelancers in Ukraine, we have freelancers all over the place. For example, recently I want to do more with the Sahel. I think Sahel's a really interesting region, especially right now, but I struggle a lot to find good freelancers in those countries. But we are absolutely able to, engage freelance journalists. But the same things go, it's the same thing that I was saying earlier, which is, as long as the pitch is distinctive, as long as you are giving us access that we wouldn't be able to get ourselves, and that we're now, of course, looking for someone who can do it all. In that we need them to write, we need them to be able to film, we need to be able to have them maybe even do a live shot for us. You know, it really is an all-rounder that we're looking for today, which of course is what you guys are all learning here at school. So you'll be perfect candidates later on, I'm sure.
Maybe one last question. Or shall we close it? Oh, there's one.
I had a question regarding the Epstein files in France. Would it bring up interest in the United States, like CNN's audience, to know more about all the French people that are involved in the Epstein files in France?
I think the problem is someone like Jacques Lang is not that well known. So it would have to be a name that they knew, right? Or it would have to be, it would have to somehow be a name that they recognize. You know, if it was like Gérard Depardieu, I think they'd be interested. But you know, if it's Jacques Lang, not so much. All good? Well, thank you so much for having me, guys.